Thank you for joining us for today's lecture at the Center for Global Security Research. My name is Asmar Eskedom, and I'm the Associate Deputy Director here at the Center. We're excited to host our speaker today. Her name is Dr. Lora Saalman, and she's a senior researcher at Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. She's also a member of CSAC and a senior fellow at the East-West Center. Her lecture is entitled China's and Russia's Nuclear and Space Convergence and Divergence. She'll be presenting her assessment today about the similarities and differences between China's and Russia's nuclear and space postures. Her findings are based on recent official government documents, statements, along with technological advances made by each country. She will also discuss the implications for Taiwan and also for Ukraine. After Lora concludes her talk, we'll move right into the Q&A session. So please get your questions ready for her. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Lora, to get us started.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this invitation. It's a great honor to be speaking here with this distinguished group from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories and other associated institutions. And as just mentioned, I will be discussing China's and Russia's nuclear and space postures and their levels of convergence and divergence. I will also, to a degree, be addressing the cyber aspect of this as well. This is actually based on work that I am currently engaged in through CIPRI, so I'd be happy to address some of that if it's of interest. So as mentioned, this is for a recent CIPRI paper that was published in the past few months. And for this, I surveyed, to be more specific, China's military strategy from 2015, China's national defense in the new era white paper from 2019, the military doctrine of the Russian Federation from 2010 and 2014, their basic principles of state policy on nuclear deterrence from 2020, as well as the joint statement that was released by both countries earlier this year in February, just prior to the situation in Ukraine. So in discussing each of these, I'm going to talk about how this impacts, in particular, engagement of these two countries in the longer term, and then try to talk about some of the implications, as mentioned before, for Ukraine and, of course, Taiwan. So in looking at these two countries, I found several, actually about 5 or 6 points of convergence and divergence. The first, of course, may not come as a surprise to any of you who look at these two countries. Both practice active defense and nuclear deterrence, yet China maintains a retaliatory declaratory posture and limits on nuclear retaliation to addressing nuclear use or threat of use. We know this, of course, is no first use. While China practices a preemptive form of these against both non-nuclear and nuclear contingencies, and we have seen, of course, this playing out in the Ukraine scenario. Both of these countries also have concerns over high-precision guidance, non-nuclear weapons. Yet I would argue that China has engaged, if we actually look at the two arsenals, in greater entanglement between nuclear and non-nuclear systems than has Russia. In particular, I believe that Russia, when I look at the statements and doctrine, and also, of course, at some of these platforms and the statements that have come out from President Putin, they tend to be more transparent about the nuclear payload or nuclear intent of these systems. For China, such ambiguity over whether or not the payload and also the command and control behind something is nuclear or non-nuclear, that ambiguity is integral to its deterrent. Both countries cite the need for constraints on medium and intermediate range systems, yet China has more to lose, largely speaking, from such controls, given its own strong regional arsenal that is integral to its anti-access area denial capabilities. And of course, Russia historically has remained constrained under the INF Treaty. So even while that's fallen by the wayside, it is behind China, certainly in terms of a lot of these intermediate range systems. Both countries, of course, advocate limits to U.S. missile defenses and continue to do so. Yet the geographic proximity of China's nuclear deployments to these systems and the size of its arsenal suggests that it has greater concerns than Russia. And in fact, this is something that Chinese experts, strategists, the nuclear community in general tends to continue to argue. Both countries support non-weaponization of outer space. Yet China, interestingly enough, in these documents, confines much of its discussion of space to vague challenges, while Russia's review of security threats in space is much more pervasive throughout its military doctrine and its nuclear doctrine. Now, both have concerns, of course, over information warfare. This plays out in a number of publications in addition to their official papers. However, China's primary focus in its white paper still tends to be more on cyber warfare. And in fact, the terminology that they use is cyber warfare and cybersecurity related. It's not information security. The term informationization is largely referred to in terms of strengthening China's military in these documents. By contrast, Russia's military doctrines, on the other hand, do not use the term cyber warfare. They tend to focus much more on information warfare. And if anything, I've in my recent work, it's also played out where I've noticed this idea of technological or psychological warfare, in addition to the technical side of warfare, which is on much more on the cyber side, I think is still embedded within information warfare. So information warfare, in other words, is an entire umbrella within Russia, while in China, I have actually seen two tracks emerging. One is focused much more on cyber warfare and one is focused on information warfare. They intersect. Information warfare is more pervasive. However, I would say cyber warfare, cybersecurity, things we talk about in the West are much more prominent in Chinese discussions. So what does this all mean? How does this impact engagement with the two countries in the longer term? Now, I am someone that, despite everything that's been going on, I'm still thinking about the longer game and trying to engage these countries at some point in strategic stability talks, as naive as that may be. I think that if we get to the point where the US is able to re-engage Russia in strategic stability talks at the track 1 level, or even track 1.5 and track 2 levels, or engage China in such discussions, certainly bilaterally, trilaterally is a larger stretch. Both countries have made statements, in fact, their joint statement together in February of this year, that indicate the types of topics that they'd be willing to discuss. And that's why I think it's important to recognize these similarities and differences that I just went through. So I'll go through what I think actually are the most ripe topics to engage these two countries when the security environment enables us to do so. The first of these is active defense and nuclear deterrence. Now, I just referred to this, of course, in the similarities and differences. And what I think is important to point out here is that while Russia is more preemptive in nature, as we've seen in Ukraine, and the range of external aggression includes conventional attacks, while China is more retaliatory through its no first use declaration, China's concept of deterrence has a strong sovereignty and territoriality focus, which is very similar to Russia. Further, its interpretation, I would argue, may be shifting towards a more proactive stance. Once again, potentially more similar to what we see with Russia. And I'll give some examples. Its expansion of its ICBM silos, its move towards nuclear submarine sea patrol, signs of a higher alert status, potential move towards launch on warning, fielding of dual capable systems, and even testing of a hypersonic glide vehicle on a fractional orbital bombardment system, or FOBS. These are all indicative to me that it is moving in a direction that's much more similar, much more akin to what we see with Russia and also the United States. But I think rather than looking at this as necessarily a holistic threat, I think that's actually a point at which we can start to engage China, largely because it starts to undermine their long-standing argument of asymmetry vis-a-vis these two countries. And I can get into that in the Q&A if that's of interest. The second point I want to emphasize in terms of engagement, and they actually point to this as well within their white papers and also within their joint statement, are high precision guidance non-nuclear weapons. Now, these have been an ongoing concern for both countries, particularly following the US reference to non-nuclear prompt global strike in its 2010 nuclear posture review. Russia's avant-garde system and China's test that I mentioned a few moments ago of the HGV coupled with the FOBS demonstrates its aim to penetrate US missile defenses, of course. Such advances strengthen China's nuclear deterrent and once again also indicate a point at which we can start to engage them, hopefully at a higher level on strategic stability talks and on the future of such systems. In other words, they've indicated that they want to discuss such systems in the future, and I think that we should engage them. Why? Because actually in this case, I would argue this is an area in which China and Russia have a large impetus to be ahead of the United States. And I've heard this argument from, for example, well, a number of different strategists within China. I won't name them actually because of Chatham House rule. But I think that they are this area is very ripe to engage them on, and because it's somewhere in which they are ahead of the United States, I think it's somewhere that they would actually, the U.S. would benefit from such a discussion. In terms of medium and intermediate range systems, China and Russia share common concerns over the regional deployment by external powers, which is of course read as the United States. Now, following the demise of the INF Treaty, the issue of such ground-based missiles has come to prominence, as highlighted, of course, in the China-Russia joint statement. Now, even if this is being directed at US deployments or potential deployments in the region, their joint statement suggests that China might be willing to discuss entanglement, particularly between these nuclear and non-nuclear systems. And this actually touches then upon, once again, something that the United States wants to engage these countries on, in particular China, the DF-21, the DF-21D medium-range ballistic missiles, dual-capable DF-26 IRBM or intermediate-range ballistic missiles. It's not to say China is going to put them on the table in such talks for arms control per se, but having a discussion about the escalatory risk of some of these systems and also this concept of entanglement, I think would be beneficial to all sides, frankly. Missile defense. Not surprisingly, China and Russia continue to cite this as something that they want to engage the United States on, also in the joint statement. Both connect missile defense and space-based systems as threats to their countries. What's interesting to me in reviewing these military doctrines, however, is that Russian military doctrine makes a much clearer link between these than the Chinese defense white papers. The Chinese defense white papers, when you read about space and the space domain, they're really talking much more about civilian and peaceful aims. It doesn't mean, of course, that China's only focused on civilian and peaceful aims, but it is noteworthy that their defense white papers are still focused on civilian and peaceful aims and reveal nothing about any of the other areas within space that obviously have military aims. That is in complete contrast to Russia, where there is a tremendous focus on the threats that may be raining down on them from space. Literally and figuratively. Thus, the two countries, of course, have been working on countermeasures and alleged joint development of early warning and missile defense systems. So I think because their definitions don't necessarily align, their concerns may not entirely align. This may also be a point at which the United States, among others, can engage them to try to better understand where those risks are and how the two are looking at the development of space in general. Speaking of space, that brings me to outer space. That is also something that receives a great deal of attention within certainly the joint statement itself. Now, China and Russia emphasize non-weaponization of outer space. They have for many years now. And as we know, China, Russia, and the United States have all conducted ASAT tests in the past that have generated space debris. Now, like incidents at sea, many of us can agree, I think, that there is increased potential for intentional and unintentional collisions in space, given how crowded space is and, of course, the debris itself. Now, while strategic stability talks or engagement may not necessarily result in a ban on ASATs, they still play a role in laying the groundwork. And this is something even the Biden administration has I believe, sought to encourage, is greater discussion of banning ASATs or at least limiting them and limiting the tests. And this is particularly following the unilateral U.S. commitment not to conduct destructive direct descent ASAT missile tests earlier this year. Finally, that brings me to artificial intelligence. And this is really an area that, it's obviously an area that Cypri and myself, we have done work on looking at the convergence of AI and nuclear risk. What is interesting within their joint statement is that they do raise the fact that they want to engage in talks on artificial intelligence developments. Now, you know, of course, the pessimist in me can point to the fact that obviously they want to engage the United States because the United States is seen as being ahead in this sphere. That being said, both China and Russia are moving ahead on their own developments in machine learning and autonomy. And this does have an impact on their nuclear and space programs. Since 2017, China in particular, of course, has made civil-military fusion and the pursuit of AI one of its top priorities. But there's reference, I would argue, within their joint statement to a willingness, and I'm quoting, a willingness to strengthen dialogue, I think is worth highlighting. Moreover, given the differences on cyber and information warfare and a lot of these spheres which tend to be confused or at times intersect with artificial intelligence, certainly within their military doctrines, engaging on AI actually may allow us to have a different type of conversation with Chinese interlocutors and also Russian interlocutors who are in the room, in particular because the two countries, again, are not fully in sync in terms of how they look at that space. So given that overview that I've just given you on these similarities and differences, I just want to reiterate the fact that I am not, at this stage in the game, optimistic that, of course, the two can be re-engaged in strategic stability talks at the track 1 level, given what is occurring in Ukraine and also over Taiwan. That being said, I know for a fact, at least at the track 2, and even at the track 1.5 level, there is an impetus, at least within China, to engage. And I say this because I'm a part of some of these track 2 and track 1.5 discussions with Chinese interlocutors, where they've actually been very explicit that they want to engage in strategic stability talks with the United States. They even have lists of things that they want to engage with the United States on. And I think that there are points that I highlighted today that the United States can actually, as well, derive information that it needs in terms of its own security and national defense. So it's not entirely giving away the ship, so to speak, to both sides to engage them in the future. So that is the hope, of course, in the longer term. So with that, I'm going to turn to the near term. And of course, what we see happening in Ukraine and over Taiwan and some of the implications, of course, of some of these differences and similarities that I've just mentioned between the two countries. Now, of course, in the case of Ukraine, since the beginning of the conflict, Chinese delegates within the United Nations have abstained from offering rhetorical support to Ukraine. The Chinese official media, of course, has blamed the conflict on NATO expansion, criticizes the effects of economic sanctions on Russian citizens as immoral, and gives prominent coverage to Russian accusations against the United States, including on these biological and chemical weapons laboratories. This alignment is not new. China has previously cited concerns over NATO and understanding of Russia's dilemma in its statements in its defense white paper, for example, from 2019. Thus, even prior to their 2022 China-Russia joint statement, China was citing NATO as a threat, or at least an understanding of the threat that NATO may pose. Moreover, China has a long-standing view of US encirclement, which mirrors, I think, to a large degree what we hear coming out of Russia. In the Chinese case, though, they're, of course, couching this encirclement as first hindering its rise, forming a new NATO within Asia through its alliance networks. Most recently, they will put an emphasis, of course, on AUKUS. So in other words, the relationship between Australia, the UK, and the United States. And also creating mixed signals, or the mixed signals that are coming from the United States, particularly in terms of its high-level visits and statements on Taiwan. The Pelosi visit, of course, fits into this as well, but there are many other examples, even prior to her visit to Taiwan or the more recent visits that we've seen. For example, the PLA officers with which I do maintain some level of contact with would lament the fact that they were not able to read where the United States is coming from, and perhaps that's the U.S. form of strategic ambiguity in all this. But it does have the potential to lead to some form of escalation where they're unable to anticipate where the United States is headed. And the argument, of course, is that the United States is moving away from its one China policy. And I just heard this, in fact, in a roundtable the other week with Chinese interlocutors. Now, this being said, the only case in which I can see China's hand potentially being forced on Ukraine, at least in terms of rhetoric, action I can't promise, certainly in the case of sanctions, would be if Russia were to test or to use a nuclear weapon in the confines of this conflict, or perhaps in the expansion of this conflict. During the 1990s, China issued vis-a-vis Ukraine both negative security assurances, in other words, a commitment not to attack or to threaten a non-nuclear weapons state with nuclear weapons, but they also provided positive security assurances vis-a-vis Ukraine. In other words, the commitment to provide assistance to a nuclear or a non-nuclear weapon state attacked by a state using nuclear weapons. And this is important, of course, because we've already crossed the Rubicon, so to speak, because the threat certainly is there as well. And in fact, as recently as 2013, China and Ukraine issued a joint statement reiterating that in accordance with UN Security Council Resolution 984 and the statement of the Chinese government on 4 December 1994 on security assurances to Ukraine, China undertakes unconditionally not to use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine as a non-nuclear weapon state, and to provide those corresponding security assurances, those positive security assurances to Ukraine in the event of aggression or threat of aggression against Ukraine using nuclear weapons. Again, the threat of aggression is there, and the threat of aggression, of course, has already occurred, at least in the recent crisis. Nevertheless, when we think about China and how diplomatically they're thinking of this pledge that they've made vis-a-vis Ukraine, what constitutes corresponding security assurances remains vague and indicates that China may continue to support Russia for the foreseeable future, or at least abstain, despite its previous commitments to Ukraine. Now, as to whether China would, similar to Russia, apply nuclear coercion when it comes to Taiwan or other territorial disputes with Japan, among others, Chinese nuclear scientists and strategists will tell you categorically no. This is due to their no first use commitment. And once again, this is an argument I heard about a week or two ago in a roundtable that I'm involved with. However, China's lean towards a more proactive nuclear posture, and I write about this in other forums known as 主动防御 instead of 积极防御. 主动防御 is more proactive, meaning it's a more preemptive concept, a more forward-leaning, a more offensive concept than their traditional active defense. As that increasingly aligns with elements of Russian nuclear posture, as well as increased application of nuclear coercion through ambiguity and entanglement of nuclear and non-nuclear systems, cannot be ruled out as something which China is going to apply in the future and has already, frankly, begun to apply vis-a-vis Taiwan. And just to cite a few examples of that, this is already evident with flights of Chinese nuclear-capable bombers into Taiwanese airspace and adjacent to its airspace, as well as over the Sea of Japan, in May and June of this year, alongside, of course, the events that have been occurring in Ukraine. The Sea of Japan case is even more provocative as it was conducted in concert with Russian strategic bombers as President Joe Biden attended a Quad summit in Tokyo. So, of course, there is a difference between the show of force and military action that we have seen playing out in Ukraine. Nonetheless, nuclear coercion remains in the background of each, and so does Ukraine. And this is my final point that I want to drive home in all this, because I've been following the debate within China, and when I can, watching their strategic talk shows that they have in the evenings and throughout the day with retired PLA, among other retired officials. And this fascination with this fixation on Russia, on Ukraine, is ever prominent. If I had to point to one other thing, though, that I have seen starting to peek through since I actually wrote this presentation, is that they do have strong concerns, or there are strong concerns in China over the safety of the nuclear facilities in Ukraine. They are very closely following the IAEA visits that were conducted recently to Ukraine. They are very concerned about power being cut off at these facilities, about the personnel at these facilities, about a breach or a shelling of artillery within these facilities. So this is, again, something that I think that if we're looking for areas in which we can positively engage China, that would be another example. And in closing, I was just at the NPT review conference recently. And if you look at the Chinese statement, and if you look at what they're pushing for in terms of security assurances, in this case, negative security assurances, what reads through a lot of that is there is still an implicit pointing to Ukraine. So I do think it's very prevalent in their minds. Whether or not they're actually in the international sphere going to be able to come forward, though, with, say, a statement condemning Russia. I'm not optimistic on that point, unless, of course, Russia does in the end test or use a nuclear weapon in the conflict that we're seeing today. So with that, I'm going to close my initial comments, and I very much look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.